Liberalism is indisputably the foremost ideology of the West, perhaps even the world. I am, of course, referring to the philosophy of liberalism, rather than the colloquial American use of the word as a synonym for leftism. The philosophy refers to a large and diverse tradition of ideas, making it difficult to define. For our purposes, we will use John Gray's description of the core tenets and commonalities of liberal trains of thought, which is as follows. Common to all variants of the liberal tradition is a definite conception, distinctively modern in character, of man and society. It is individualist in that it asserts the moral primacy of the person against the claims of any social collectivity. Egalitarian, inasmuch as it confers on all men the same moral status and denies the relevance to legal or political order of differences in moral worth among human beings. Universalist, affirming the moral unity of the human species and according a secondary importance to specific historic associations and cultural forms. And meliorist, in its affirmation of the corrigibility and improvability of all social institutions and political arrangements. It is this conception of man and society which gives liberalism a definite identity which transcends its vast internal variety and complexity. These principles of individualism, egalitarianism, universalism, and meliorism are the foundations upon which all other liberal values and ideas rest on, and in turn, much of the modern Western philosophical corpus. They are, however, all wrong, and I'll explain why. While these ideas have existed in one form or another for centuries, largely as part of English cultural tradition, they were first formally expressed and unified in the 17th century by Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. Hobbes's ideas were based on the thought experiment known as the state of nature, which was a hypothetical scenario of either a society where the state had dissolved or an era before states were invented. Hobbes reasoned that without a state there would be no laws or law enforcement, and therefore there'd be no reason for men to cooperate. Subsequently, society would dissolve into lone individuals, constantly in conflict with one another. As Hobbes himself wrote, "This makes it obvious that for as long as men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, they are in a condition known as war, and it is a war of every man against every man. In such conditions there is no place for hard work, because there is no assurance that it will yield results, and, worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short." This was a radical idea in his time, when the authority of states and monarchs had a divine origin and the power proceeded from above. Hobbes inverted this hierarchy. The authority of a monarch and his state came from the necessity of security, which justified the citizens surrendering some of their freedoms in a social contract. John Locke, on the other hand, disagreed with the conclusion of Hobbes, particularly with Hobbes's rejection of liberty. Locke viewed liberty as a core human value, a natural right of all men, along with the rights to property and life itself. He believed that these rights could be derived from the rational observation of nature, and therefore, that humans did not require a common power to keep them all in awe, as Hobbes put it. Rather, Locke asserted that men had natural laws to live by. As he saw it, the state was formed voluntarily by its citizens for protection against external threats. Therefore, laws were not meant to preserve peace. Their purpose should be to preserve freedom. As Locke himself put it, the end of law is not to abolish or restrain, but to preserve and enlarge freedom. From Locke's state of nature and natural rights, the obvious conclusions to derive are the aforementioned principles of liberalism, individualism, egalitarianism, universalism, and meliorism. His state of nature is, in essence, individualist in that all social collectives are based on the consent of the individuals who comprise them, and that the individuals thus hold the moral primacy. Egalitarian in that every individual has the exact same natural rights, independent of any estate rights that they may have, and universalist in that there is a unity of humanity that supersedes belonging to any particular cultural or historical collective. The meliorist principle was conceived later, during the emergence of modernism and the idea of progress, which was the topic of my previous video. One could make the case, however, that since the individual is given moral precedent over the social collective, it gives the individual the right to abolish the traditions and customs of old in favor of potential improvement, thus establishing the tendency towards meliorism and the later progressive modernism. These are the principles of liberal philosophy, and by extension, a great deal of contemporary Western thought, especially those who consider themselves as politically liberal. From these principles, the Western world has developed free market economies, judicial rights protected under a constitution, and, at least in part, democracy. But there is one problem. These principles are a work of fiction. Before I explain why, some may be asking, well, why does it matter whether these principles are real or not? Just look at the outcomes of liberalism. Individual rights, free markets, democracy. These are good things. The foundations of liberalism may be fictitious, but its results speak for themselves. This is the position of, among others, political commentator Short Fat Otaku, elaborated in his video, Liberalism's Great Flaw. This question, however, begs another question. Why are they good? By what criteria? The criteria used to judge liberalism come from liberalism itself. That is to say, its standards are self-referential. For example, liberal democracy is seen as good because it prevents the oppression of the individual by tyranny. However, valuing the preservation of individual liberty is judged as good by liberalism's own standards. Any criteria by which a society is judged will necessarily have an arbitrary ideological influence, but judging a society using criteria based on the same foundations as the society itself will always, of course, give satisfactory answers. Therefore, such judgments have no real intellectual currency. With that having been said, let's return to the earlier question. Why are the principles of liberalism bogus? It's because the state of nature and Locke's conclusions about it are also bogus. More specifically, his assertion that groups are founded on the consent of their constituent individuals. In prehistory, humans naturally formed clans and tribes, groups which you were born into. People did not participate in these groups simply because they entered into them, but because of our biological proclivity to do so. This makes sense. Humans are social animals. This is why seemingly trivial acts, such as gossip, are so pleasurable to us in spite of their immorality. It's how we orient ourselves in our social environment. But in such an environment, the individual's will can never take precedent over the group's well-being. Therefore, such an inverted hierarchy of will is an unnatural state. Nor would humans, in a true state of nature, be egalitarian, since humans always comprise larger groups, and groups always maintain a hierarchy in one form or another. The parent always holds authority over the child, the elderly over the young, and the chief over the tribesman. Finally, we have not been universalist either. A simple review of history would disprove this, as tribal conflict has existed as long as tribes themselves. It's part of our nature to war with each other. If you were to base the organization of society exclusively around our base biological nature, if such a thing can even be isolated, you would not adhere in the least to Locke's supposedly natural rights of man, because there's nothing natural about it. This lack of justification behind liberalism may well be why fascism takes root so easily. While liberalism champions human ideals, fascism repudiates them and declares that there is, and will only ever be, lawless power struggles between different ethnic groups or nations, that the entirety of human history is just a game of world domination. The fall of the Berlin Wall and subsequent collapse of the Soviet Union was not the first time that liberalism triumphed as the dominant ideology of the world. After World War I, the regimes of the Central Powers were replaced with liberal democracies. But before long, discontentment grew, which culminated in the rise of fascism, resulting in industrial killing the likes of which had never been seen prior. After the defeat of the Axis powers, liberalism faced off against socialism in a 50-year Cold War, from which it emerged triumphant. But what are we seeing today across the Western world, in election after election? Populism, radicalism leaning in an increasingly fascist direction, and growing disillusionment with the powers that be. Perhaps, when all is said and done, the solution will not be to cling to liberalism any longer, but to go beyond it, to a system that avoids the pitfalls that liberalism has stumbled into all too many times.